Perfect. Okay, so one of the great things that we have kind of been able to isolate and incorporate the recent findings, and that's what we like. This presentation has changed from last week in some of the recommendations that we're sharing with you. So as you move forward, if you have information that we are not aware of, please share it with the group so that everyone has the up-to-date information. I'm going to go ahead and next slide, please. Let's go over the objectives for this particular module. So we're going to review. Then we're going to go ahead and work on that assessment piece, and that's very critical. We're going to look at what's already in place in our produce system nationwide in terms of pointing to some best practices. And then also how you can develop new SOPs, which are standard operating procedures, processes, and enhancements that relate directly to COVID-19. We're going to talk about why we emphasize staff training so much, and also those record keeping, corrective actions kinds of things. So when FSMA came out, I guess we were talking, they started talking about 10 years ago. When FSMA came out in terms of the produce safety impact, um, everyone thought it was going to be massive, and it is a large undertaking, and it's promoting a new way of thinking in terms of assessing, correcting, and monitoring your practices on the farm. But what we found is that most produce farmers in the United States are doing a really good job, and they really don't have a whole lot of situations where they have contamination issues, major recalls, those kinds of things. I mean, there are a few out there, but overall, most folks in the produce world do a good job. They understand that that product that they deliver to consumer has to be fresh, safe, and healthy in order to instill the confidence. What we have found, though, however, is as the inspection program has been implemented nationwide, is there is a serious gap in the ability for folks to document. And that's where, especially with our small to mid-sized growers, if you haven't gone through the FSMA PSA program, or you're not subject to a third-party audit, be it GAP or another one, the record keeping portion of it is something that you haven't had to do in order to quote unquote pass those particular programs. So we are going to emphasize that it is important for you to work with your growers so that they understand that documentation, as painful as they think it might be, is very critical. And especially, as Barbara pointed out, with this particular pathogen, because traceability and tracking back is so important. So those are the outcomes that we're going to look at in terms of this particular module. Next slide. So the key slide that I want you to remember from module 1 that Barbara just went through is this concept of how is this particular virus transmitted. I'm going to go ahead and give you a bit of a scenario, and hopefully this will help tie it together. But when you're teaching first responders and they arrive at a scene, I remember in particular a photograph where you looked at the photograph and you decided what was safe for that first responder. So as a farm operator, that's you. You're the first responder. You're looking at the whole scene, or in this case, the whole farm. And what you want to do is start doing some self-assessing. And I think that's another particular skill that we can be really effective at showing people how to do, which is to look at everything holistically. So you may have a transmission pole across a car that's obviously been damaged. You've got a person inside, you've got electrical wires, all those good kinds of things. So you look at to make sure the scene is safe. So that's what you're doing on your farm. You're looking at those areas that will make your farm safe to you, your employees, your visitors, to your even to your livestock. So that's what we're looking at, is looking at that and then incorporating where and how you can get this particular virus. And that will allow you to focus in on the areas that you need to. And so for that car accident scenario, we look at the driver inside who is obviously injured, and we look at what is the mechanism of injury. So in this case, we're going to look at what is the mechanism of transmission. So we know it's person to person, it's respiratory, it's dealing with that safe distance space and what's happening in there. And that's where you're going to focus on in terms of dealing with your farm to start with. So at the end, we'll go back to that flat farm and we'll be able to tie it all together. And so I think that if you present this material in terms of that holistic farm view, we have to start with that person to person contact. So we know, based on what Barbara said, those mechanisms, the things that we have, that we're looking at in terms of where can folks get that disease. And it all comes back to your staff, your interactions with the public, that one-on-one personal contact. Next slide. So that begs to ask the question, who are our visitors? We have visitors to the farm. Who are your visitors? So we have defined that in terms of anyone who comes on the farm that has a one-to-one interaction. Again, how is a pathogen going to get on your get in or on your operation? It's going to happen person to person. So we need to look at everyone who's coming through the doors. Any one-to-one interaction outside of the farm, you have to consider that you're sending your employees to the farmers market. So they're interacting with the general public for a certain amount of time. Next point. It's general public and staff interaction. So you've got the general public that you're introducing in addition to the staff. So all of a sudden that whole farm view in terms of what you're looking at to develop action plans related to this disease has very much expanded. That circle has expanded. So we don't say that so that you can address every single situation, but what are the components that will help our staff and the general public interact with our operation, be it on farm or off? And hint, not all your visitors are going to be human. And we know that there's not a lot of documented cases, but at the same time, it's important to look at that as a potential pathway so that eventual respiratory contact takes place. Next slide, next point rather. So we're going to go ahead and use an interactive flow chart that helps you assess who are the individuals that are coming to my farm. So before we do that, we're going to take 30 seconds, go to your chat box, and tell me an example of who is coming into contact with your farm, be it on or off. So go ahead and just throw up one particular. There you go, Karen, Stacy rather. Thank you for starting. Now they're following. We've got vet, Barbara. You go ahead and let you monitor that. Absolutely, employees, school kids, neighbors. Perfect. Buyers and suppliers. Thank you, Dee. You pickers, great. Visiting family, exactly. You're going to introduce them to your world, even if they're coming for Thanksgiving dinner. So that's what we have done is gave you a blank one of these in the resources, but extension agents, yes, exactly. Again, thinking about that whole idea of who comes into your farm. We're usually so focused on getting those employees checked in and making sure that they're healthy. A lot of times we don't realize that there are other visitors to our farm that we need to consider. Next slide. So this is kind of a brainstorm that we did. Again, we have provided this as a blank. So you've got your visitors to the farm or the packing area, and who are they? Those are just some examples. Me, the staff, Fido, those kinds of folks. So that's what you're looking at. You're not just looking at that roster of folks on the payroll. Next slide. So then I would encourage you, and this is also provided as a resource, is to also take it that one step out, expand that circle, and look at who are the interactions that are happening off farm that are coming back onto the farm. And that's what this worksheet allows you to do, is to think about that. It could be the person who's delivering your feed. It could be the person who's working on your ventilation system. It could be the health inspector. Lots of different folks that have possible interaction somehow with on your farm.
Well, and
So that
also all the things when your staff go off the farm. So if they're going to the
go back.
farmers
Yeah,
in there, if they're going to take a sample into the local ag university, if they're, so any of those places where you or your staff are going off the farm, that's also potential risk factors in there.
next slide. So we then look at, okay, we've identified the fact that we've got that person-to-person contact, which we know is the primary route of transmission for this particular virus. Now we have to look at what areas are we already doing some of the things that are considered key strategies. And what we're going to advocate to you is a lot of this you already have in place. It's a matter of enhancing, recognizing that mechanism of injury, and doing some adaptation or modifications. So we start off with the infamous hand washing in restroom facility. So we know that this is not a fecal or oral transmission, but we also have lots of services in that hand wash and restroom facility that are critical because exposure can happen. Usually those are tight confines, environmentally. They tend to have lots of space where pathogens can continue to thrive and grow. You're going to have a lot of closer contact than you normally would, unless you provide some mitigation strategies to help reduce that space, expand that space. And then we're back to the good old hand washing. I mean, when COVID first started, there became a national consciousness, is what I like to call it, on the importance of hand washing. And for those of us that have been working with farmers and growers, we all knew the importance of hand washing. We all knew that if we were doing agritourism or pick your own, we were providing hand washing opportunities. And all of a sudden the world started to sing happy birthday again. And we've been doing it for a long time as farmers. So again, any of that review and any ways you can enhance that become important. And also focusing on those restroom facilities. So what are my strategies? What can I do to improve the effectiveness of hand washing, and also the restroom facility itself in terms of providing the best scenario you can in terms of not spreading the disease? So I'm going to go back to my staff training. I'm going to make sure, even if it's the 20th time that they've done it, that they understand and know what hand washing techniques should be used. Following CDC guidelines on that in terms of providing the elements of a hand wash station. And we're going to go over that in a second. Increasing the numbers of all those. Getting some more porta potties in the harvest field, providing that signage. Have you put a sign up and it wasn't laminated and now you can't hardly read it? Are we going to go ahead and do that? Do we need to put it in a second language? Those are all strategies that we can do that, yeah, we're talking about COVID, but we're also talking about just basic processes and procedures that your farm already has in place. Now,
and you can up your game with some of this, because if you've done it like 20 times, like Cindy said, because we know how critical this is for all facets of food safety, you can use some of the new and novel things that came out of coronavirus. I have a particular video that I'm actually putting in the resources. If you haven't seen it, Alton Brown from the Food Network has done a hand washing video that is actually educational, but also entertaining. There are two versions. If you're squeamish, don't watch the original. But he goes through a very specific explanation of why soap and water works in there, and actually shows you how to do the hand washing correctly. So sorry, I had to put my plug in, Sydney. You know how much I love that video.
Well, and the point we talked about that video incorporating, and it's how to make your trainings more stimulating to your students, and the fact that many of these strategies are used in other fields. So that's why we like that. Plus we both like Alison Brown. Next slide. So now this is somewhat, it's not new to us that have been teaching farm safety for a long time, but what it is new is how to differentiate it to the general public. So we start off with hand washing. What is hand washing? Got the steps there. This would be a great signage tool for your folks as a reminder, even after you do your staff training. So we're walking through those basic steps that we talk about in terms of hand washing. With that in mind, next slide. We need to look at what does that hand wash station look like. For those of you that have had PSA or other kinds of produce training, we know that there are basic elements of the hand wash station. Barb, are you annotating for me?
Well, I will.
Okay, so we've got the water from an approved source. Most folks know that the got cooler has become kind of that standby for the hand wash station. We're going to look at that as terms of water from an approved source. What is an approved source? It's defined as potable water in the jurisdiction that you're working at. If you have any questions about that and how you would test for that, I'm going to refer you to Karen Cox.
Sorry.
She's That's all right. Karen's on the call with us, and she's done a real extensive program in terms of determining and finding sources that can actually test your water. If you're from a municipal water source, that's not an issue. But again, back to what are the basics of that hand wash station? You got to have an approved water source. One of the big changes is lots of folks use the got coolers that have the push buttons, and we're recommending that you really can't do that, especially when we're talking about contact with pathogens. So make sure you have some kind of a spigot as opposed to a push button. To the best of your ability, you need to try to have warm water, especially if you're out in the field. Remember, got coolers are insulated, so you can actually put warm water in there. And by the time lunchtime rolls around, it may not be exactly at 100 degrees, but it's going to be warmer than cold. Thank you, Karen Cox. I'll let Barbara explain what she just put up. We also have to have a catch basin for the gray water, and also remember, as an extension of that, make sure you know where you're going to make sure you know where you're going to dispose that. Trash cans, again, in this COVID world, I would recommend that you look at the size of your trash can. The office trash can is probably not going to work anymore. If you have liners, you need to make sure they're changed out regularly. And it kind of defeats the purpose if you have a hand wash station and you have overflowing towels and debris from that. It's not helping to contribute to that cleanliness concept. Disposable towels. Make sure that you have a dispenser for that. A lot of times you'll find folks that'll take a stack of those foldable towels, and they'll stick a rock on top. And so when someone goes to grab one, they've managed to expose their hands to all of the ones down below. And then you also have your bar or liquid soap. And remember, and I know everyone knows this is not hand sanitizer. This is bar soap or liquid. Next slide.
Oh, hang tight. Wait, I got clear.
So now we're going to introduce that hand rub, and that may be the different phrase that you all have not used before, but the vernacular has become pretty commonplace, especially in the COVID world. So when your hands are visibly soiled, much like a contact surface, we know that you can't disinfect and sanitize unless you have a clean surface. So if you've got those field workers coming in and they're taking a break, you might want to start with a hand rub, which is where you apply your liquid, what am I trying to say? Sanitizer. the hand gels, and go ahead and get rid of that debris. Do you have a nail brush at a wash stand? Are you able to provide the tools that they need to rub your hands as opposed to doing that deep clean that you're going to find with the hand wash process? Barbara?
Yep.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Um, Next slide. There we go. Okay, I'm going to back up actually to the previous slide, and I'm going to introduce folks. Last week we talked about glow bugs. So glow bugs are wonderful. Again, I know we have Karen on the phone, and she's a huge believer of them. So most extension agents have access to the glow germ sanitizing solution. When they first came out, you would go ahead and set up a tent facility where you could go ahead and have the light underneath. They now have that particular solution in bottles, and you are able to actually do this on the farm or in the classroom, where you can have the students wash their hands, start with a hand rub, go ahead and look at that under the infrared light, and then also have them go and do a full hand wash and see where they're at in terms of how they're reducing the pathogen load on their hands. So we've given you the link to those, and if you want recommendations, I know the West Virginia Food Safety Training Team has several of those, and we take them out in the field, and folks just really like it because it's a way to be able to do that and not have the big tent set up. They actually put their hands underneath. You want to make sure that you provide for sanitizing in between contacts, but it's also a great tool that you can even use in school groups, and it helps determine your effectiveness of the glow bug. There you go. And so, yeah, we love putting those under the hands underneath there and really highlighting the effectiveness and importance of hand washing. PPE was another big item that came up during the initial outbreak, and the fact that it was hard to get. So when we talk a little bit about supply chain, thinking about your resources in terms of PPE, um, and the whole disruption to the supply chain. So the supply chain disruption happened not just with food, but also with the things that we needed in order to package and get our produce out into the marketplace. I was speaking to somebody yesterday, and they have a particular packaging product that they use, and they usually get their delivery. They usually order in December for delivery in March. This past year, they ordered in October for delivery in March, and they were told last week that they are not to expect that packaging material until December of this year. So the supply chains for everything are a bit wacky. So it's important for you to point that out to your folks so that they can do adequate planning. So PPE is part of that. So again, we're going back to that mechanism of transference. We know that that respiratory issue and hands, not, I'm sorry, mouth and nose are critical. So those are the areas that we're focusing on with the PPE, personal protective equipment. We also want to make sure that when there's the potential for close contact or close transference, that we have existing and use our SOPs during those critical periods, standing operating procedures, making sure that staff has reviewed them, update them. If you're going to add another, you're going to change your required masks to ones that you provide, or instead of individuals bringing their own harvesting tools, you're going to now provide those. Those all indicate a time to update those standard operating procedures and use them. And to use them, you have to train on them. So again, working on that staff training just to make sure everybody's on the same page. Consider providing that required PPE. If you're gonna do masks with them, are they allowed to bring their own in, or are you gonna provide them? Same with gloves. Again, if you have good standard operating procedures in terms of washing, and you provide the washing facilities and that kind of thing, then that may be an answer of yes. If not, then you may want to just go ahead and provide that so that everybody's consistent and following the same procedures.
And let me follow up on the glove one. There is no recommendations that I've seen where you have to wear gloves in terms of in the production area. I have some staff that likes to wear gloves. I don't. I'd much rather just make sure I wash my hands more repeatedly. A lot of my staff gets very comfortable in thinking the glove is protecting them and they're not paying attention to where all they're touching. So if all they're doing is touching the plant or the potting media, that's fine. But once they start touching their nose, their mouth in there inadvertently. So making sure if you really go down the glove route that you really think about it and really train them on how to put them on properly, take them off, more importantly, properly, dispose of them, and also, you know, what the glove really is there for and what it's not there for. I'll also give you another one. I just had to buy gloves for my lab. The price of the gloves has quadrupled for me. And so make sure you're very aware and are on top of it and make sure you've got your supplies, because if I went with any others, it was going to take months. In fact, I'm still waiting on one size of gloves that I ordered last fall, and I don't think I'm ever going to see them. So be careful on some of these, but gloves for me is a big issue because I don't think people understand why they're using them. So make sure you're really clear with your growers on if they choose or not to choose to use them.
And also, as part of your extension work and outreach, you know, making farm operators and procurement folks aware of the supply chain disruption is going to be important to help them with their planning and going back through their SOPs and evaluating where they're at. Also, I'm going to encourage you again, understanding that we're working with a lot of PPE that is disposable, making sure that you have covered containers for that to go into. Create the expectations that you want through your SOPs and your training, and then communicate them and continue to reinforce those. Next slide.
Monitor and correct as needed.
Yep. Next slide. So again, and this one was one that I hadn't seen a whole lot, and I thought it was great. It was from West Virginia, but it talks about that it's a very visual way of understanding how to wear your mask, but also more importantly, how to remove it and dispose of it. So this might be a nice visual that you would give to as a resource for farmers to post. And again, you know, we're talking about that employee communication, but that also applies to your visitors. When your visitor goes into a restroom, if you're allowed access to that, having those particular pieces of information just shows that your culture and your expectations while they're on that farm are directly related to their safety and reducing disease transmission. The other thing we talked about in this section was, you know, shared laundries. Making sure that you have adequate hamper facilities to be able to dispose of anything that you're going to clean. Some folks don't do that in-house anymore because of making sure that they have that deep clean of the clothing. Again, we know it's not a primary contact transmission site, but it is something to look at in terms of overall sanitation. Next slide. So you look at your shared and common areas. We know during all of this COVID that outside has become king. Those of us in the outdoor recreation industry and agritourism know that there is a huge pent up demand to come outside, but they're not doing it at places where there's large crowds. So consider bridging that to your employees. This happens to be an example that Barbara found of an employee at a large produce operation taking a break, socially distancing, providing a clean surface, and taking that time and utilizing the outdoor and distancing. So think about that in terms of identifying on your flat map those shared or common areas where there's public interaction, but also there's an opportunity for you to provide a socially distanced space and an opportunity to reduce the opportunity of disease transmission during those downtimes. And the shared areas are critical in terms of, you know, if you're doing agritourism, are you going to provide food? and at what point do you not provide food based on local health department rules versus at what point do you feel safe to being able to do that? Have I provided enough distancing in the ordering process? Am I doing cashless transactions? Anything to reduce that one-on-one contact that has to do with any kind of respiratory potential in terms of person to person. So face masks are important. I know a lot of jurisdictions have decided that face masks aren't required as we get more towards that whole idea of herd immunity. But remember, an individual operation or business can still require masks, and so don't discount that as the coronavirus pandemic impact lessens. Because it still might be a strategy that you're going to employ, especially when you're looking at public to employee interactions. Review your
Wait a minute,
sanitize.
before you leave that one, the whole thing of people who are asymptomatic, you can't tell from looking at somebody whether or not they actually have COVID-19 and it's just a lower case, or that they somehow have it on them and can get onto you. So bear in mind, you still have to be at a more vigilant one because you're not just dealing with your employees that you're working with, but you're dealing with general public in there. I actually don't have a farm, but I have this because I have a laboratory group. And so I have to make decisions for us so that we actually still are and will be wearing masks in there until we are at least all vaccinated. But I have staff that have either a young child or another one who has a mother who has a health condition that cannot be vaccinated. And so understanding those pieces are going to adjust my thinking in terms of shared and common areas in there. So talking with your staff and making sure you keep your staff and yourself as risk-free as you can.
So again, you may increase the frequency of your cleaning and sanitizing. That expands beyond the restrooms. For some of produce, the small and mid-sized produce growers, they're using their home restroom as the on-farm sanitation facility. And we also know that them coming into your home and contact with your home may be something that you don't want. So this might be a good time to consider incorporating maybe a porta potty or some other
or
sanitation.
constructing your own hand wash. And you can make that hand wash that Cindy went through the whole thing. We have the link to making those, and you can make them for like $35, and it can be broken down and put on a truck to take with you to the farmer's market, as well as take around the farm.
So again,
hello, may I come in?
Connie?
Yeah,
Question?
my name is from Tuskegee University. We've also developed the hand wash station, which is hands-free. You don't touch the faucet.
Well, if you'd like to send that to us, we'll appreciate it. I'll put my email in the chat and send that, and we'll put resources.
Like it.
Okay.
Like it. So again, we're back to not really doing anything terribly new. We're just enhancing. Next slide. So we also want to look at health and injury and illnesses within our employees. Again, Barbara just mentioned asymptomatic. It's a great percentage of the cases. And we also had a comment that the viral load is critical during those first 2 days after exposure.
No. First 2 days, the first 2 days prior to showing symptoms.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Didn't read that all the way. But we also do know that it is a heavy viral load with the respiratory transmission immediately when it's done, and environmental issues such as humidity and temperature greatly impact not only the viral load, but also how long it stays on surfaces or in the air. So we want to go ahead and look at those employees that are showing up that may be asymptomatic, that may have exposure to family members or others that are asymptomatic. And so we want to revisit that portion of our farm operation where we have reporting procedures. Do you have a point person? If someone shows up and they're ill, who do they report to? Who do they say that to? Who is the person who recognizes that there needs to be more towels at the hand wash station? Those kinds of things. So have a point person related to health, injury, illness, and just overall farm safety. And so make it so that that point person is able to correct issues, but also that one that folks feel comfortable reporting to. Train your staff on the signs and symptoms. It's not just putting up a poster. Asking them, how are you feeling? Have you had any of these traits? There's a questionnaire, and we'll provide some resources after this slide, where there's just some very common questions that you can ask. We want to make sure that you're not going to be punishing staff for reporting exposure or symptoms. So think about how you're going to encourage your employees to do that, incentivize them. Is there another place they can work where they're not in a situation where they're coming into contact with others? Look at your visitor log. Look at the spots on your farm where your staff checks in. Are you going to give them a questionnaire that they can fill out? Have you had any of these symptoms? Those are all potential strategies that can help you identify ill workers. Why do we want to do that? As Barbara alluded to in the first section, the health department may show up and say, you've got an employee or you had a visitor on your farm that has an active case, and now we're trying to do that contract tracing. So how are you going to be able to do that? And how are you going to be able to do that while maintaining privacy? Again, you want to have the information and be able to share it if someone comes and asks, but at the same time, also making sure that people understand that those are the reasons why you're tracing their movements on the farm. Let's see, look back at your operational requirements again, those SOPs if they need to be modified. Remember to always check with your local health department to make sure that those quarantine recommendations are being followed, and communicate with your staff. Again, training does not equal communication. Communication is ongoing. Next slide. So those are the typical signs that you see with those signs and symptoms of COVID. Remember, if you have employees that don't have English as a primary language, you may need to help them interpret what that means and how it relates to their personal condition and feelings.
And a number of the resources we have, if you go back to like CDC and even WHO, but CDC in particular, they have it in a number of different languages. So you have the ability to do that if your growers need things in other languages.
Okay, next slide. So Barbara, I'm going to let you explain this.
All right, so one of the things I was looking for was to have a screening sign-in sheet. So something that your staff could fill out every day they come into work, that you could ask those kind of screening questions in there. And I could find some, but none of them were anything that you could actually take and use. They were either you buy it or just here's an example. So I've actually made one, not only for screening your staff, but there's a second one in there for screening any visitors so that you can share that with your growers so that they've got something. So this hits on the date, so you know what date they logged in, and then ask them, have they experienced any symptoms of COVID-19? Have they been in contact, or are they isolating or quarantined because they may have been exposed, or are they waiting on results of a COVID-19 test in there? If you've got yes to any of those, that should be a flag that they need to be working elsewhere or at home, but that they shouldn't be in contact with a lot of other people because they could be a risk to others, both your other staff, yourself, as well as any visitors to the farm in there. So trying to keep those numbers down so that you don't have situations that come in that way. So Another one that isn't really talked about, but is really critical that Cindy and I figured out is you really need to talk about hydration. Um, we always press it in terms of working with people who are working anywhere on the farm, greenhouses, high tunnels, as well as the field. But because you're going to be wearing a mask, which is going to put a lot more stress on the body, having water stations available or individual bottled water um, available as well is going to be important to make sure for your staff to keep them hydrated. Just make sure the water's potable, and don't have them sharing bottles or even um, drinking bottles of any sort. This is an ideal time to get your staff all revved up and give them their own labeled bottles. So if you use a refilling station, that they've got that. One hint though, please make sure that you train them on how to use the refilling station. We have one on our floor, and we found that the other group is not filling them properly and is actually touching the bottles where people's mouths are in it to the tap. And so our group is no longer using that. I'm providing our own individual water, or people are bringing water from home. So, okay, so Cindy, I'm going to give you shared tools.
Perfect. So again, another area that we determined in that overview and share self-assessment is where else are folks coming into contact with either each other or a surface. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in the next unit because it's one of those ones that kind of falls into both. But consider assigning tools to staff. Do you have a process so that when one person has a shovel, the next person that has it has an opportunity to either clean or sanitize or somehow prevent any kind of pathogen contamination. You want to determine what those procedures are, make sure that they're developed as SOPs. Again, train, monitor, and redirect if necessary, or also think about that procedure in terms of, is it working? Is it accomplishing what I want it to do in terms of COVID or any other pathogens? Log sheets are critical. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Record keeping is the one spot where our produce folks could use help in. And it's also, I'm sure most of you have heard the phrase, I hate record keeping. I don't have time. So kind of trying to brainstorm ways that it can work where you can get the information, because we all know if it's not documented, it didn't happen, but at the same time make it so that it's part of the daily operation and flow. And this also is a way for you to look at all of the things that your employees are coming into contact with and make sure that your COVID response or any kind of pathogen threat response is far reaching, and that you really have your employees and your visitors at the core of what you're doing.
And
Um,
and don't forget that record keeping doesn't just have to be paper records. It could be electronic. It could be something as simple as a blackboard where you have spots that have to be filled out every day. And at the end of the day, somebody photographs it. So you've got a record of it. They erase it and start over. So whatever works for that operation, you need to give them the tools that they can utilize what works best for theirs.
And I will caution you on that. A lot of folks are doing that blackboard or dry erase. And we've been encouraging that. I'm working pretty extensively with the maple industry in West Virginia. And you also have to think about the environmental concerns. You can tell folks all day to make sure that they log in on the dry erase board, or in this case, you write down your Brix reading as a syrup comes off the evaporator. But look at the environment. If you're in a packing house that uses any kind of water, you're in a very humid environment, and what happens to that dry erase log in 5 hours later? So providing them with the right kinds of tools to be able to record things so that it's easy, but also provides a more permanent way until you can get it synthesized into whatever record keeping system you have is important. So making the cleanliness and the upkeep of those shared tools just gets enhanced more, and also thinking about ways where you can avoid the sharing concept, and it may involve assigned tools, that kind of thing. Are you going to make your staff responsible for cleaning their own tools, or are you going to provide that as part of your operation because it's that critical? Just thinking about the harvest to packing to when it leaves your farm process, and what kind of tools, hand tools in particular, you come into contact with. Next slide. So then we've got our staff who loads up the truck and goes to the local farmers market every week. So what is involved there? First of all, we're expanding the scope of the flat farm, and we're including off farm because we've got exposure and contact with other people that may not be on our visitor log into the farm. So consider, and have your folks consider, again, farm specific, but having the same level of safety and PPE, whether you're on the farm or off. Are your folks engaged in direct sales at the farmer's market? Are they wearing masks? They may have to do that because of local health department anyway, but is that one of your policies? Are you providing them with that hand wash station Barbara talked about on the tailgate of your farm truck? Are you providing your guests to that farm stand an opportunity with hand sanitizer? Are you providing some distancing by putting a table in front and creating a barrier? Are you doing some kind of a plexiglass or plastic barrier? Are you displaying the fruit and produce so that folks don't have to pick through? Are you able to accept pre-orders? All those kinds of things are critical when farm staff is going off, and there are ways that you can go ahead and reduce the exposure and also reduce the ability for those folks to bring that disease back onto the farm when they return. So look at your PPE. Look at what the local health department and premise is requiring. Make sure you provide a hand wash station and hand sanitizer at least to your employees. Consider having it available to the public. The other thing is some of the venues now are requiring that individuals have that. So again, it's going to be based on local protocol. If possible, can you display and sell your produce on wash? For example, if you're doing beets or carrots, do you have a note there that just says, we didn't wash this, we harvested it, we didn't wash it, we've brushed off the dirt, but you need to take it home, and oh yeah, by the way, you need to go ahead and wash it with your home water before you cook it. And then again, I mentioned that pre-ordering, pre-packaging, if you're going to be selling cherry tomatoes and you have a quart disposable container, it needs to be single use. It's going to go directly to the customer, going ahead and measuring out or weighing out that sales unit beforehand so that they don't have to handle the produce. Next slide. So how are you communicating with your customers? And this kind of falls into a sticky area because you're looking at public health versus your marketing and sales efforts. And there isn't any reason why the two can't combine. So make sure that you communicate the expectations to your visitors, to your staff, and to your customers, if you're offsite or onsite, in terms of what your expectations are related to enhanced COVID-19 procedures. If you're going to make them wear a mask, tell them ahead of time. Are you going to provide that mask? If not, tell them they need to bring their own. If you're not doing any food service on the farm, tell them that they need to plan on bringing any food or any water products that they need, and it needs to be disposable because you don't have the, they can't go up now to a farm stand and buy a bottle of water. Making sure that they're aware of that when they get there. Are you not letting them use the restroom in your home anymore? So therefore, there's a porta potty. Again, communicating with folks either through on-farm signage when they get there or ahead of time, and that's where social media is very useful for those of the producers that you have that have a social media and Facebook presence. There's a whole section in there where you can communicate those social media, those COVID enhanced or procedures in terms of visiting your farm and your expectations. So make sure you use those.
And don't forget to also use the other things you use already with your marketing. Use the, if you send out an email, any kind of flyers in there, but make sure that they are aware before they come what your expectations are. Any way you can get it out to them. Also, it gives them a great notice that you care not only about your staff, but you care about them, and you're, putting this in place to reduce any possibilities in there. You can also use it as an educational piece that you can't get COVID-19 from your produce.
So I'm going to specifically relate this to agritourism, folks. 2 months ago, a national survey showed that only 44% of the population was looking to plan on travel in the next 6 months in the United States. That has jumped up as of last week to a little over 70%. So consumers are looking at traveling again, but they're also looking at different kinds of travel. They're looking at road trips, something they can do in their car. They're planning on making a multi-stay, but they're doing it via car travel. Secondly, they've expanded that circle of how far they're willing to drive and travel. So it used to be 100 miles to 150 miles was a good number for the greatest percentage of your visitors if you were engaged in agritourism. That's now expanded up to 250 and 500 as a direct result of COVID. So consider that with the fact that more than 60% of travelers make their decisions to visit a place while they're on the road using their cell phone. So if you are engaged with having visitors come to your farm with the general public and you're involved in agritourism or pick your own, it's important to make sure that you have updated information that they can access when they are making those travel plans. So for example, if you're going to go ahead and have a mask requirement, making sure that that shows up on your mobile website as opposed to just going to a booking agency. So making sure that you've communicated with your customers ahead of time. When they get there, signage, they need to know. I'm sorry, I got somebody? No. Probably like me having to deal with the dog. Signage is critical. When they get there, you need to reinforce what your expectations were. So if you decided next week that you're not going to do masks anymore, and you still have it all over your social media, and when they get there, the signs are still up, but your employees aren't practicing it. You're not modeling the behavior that you want. That's awful confusing to folks. And it also doesn't lend a whole lot to your credibility that you're taking this disease seriously, and that as a marketing tool, you want to instill confidence rather than conflict.
And Cindy, let me go in, not just agritourism and UPIC, but if you have an on-farm stand in there, this is going to also affect as well as if you have the farmers market off, or if you're going into consignment. So all of those pieces are critical, and it's making sure that you're clear what your brand and your food safety part of that brand is.
Perfect. I like that. Yeah. Bringing in the brand. Yeah. And so that's all part of consistent communication. We talked about, can you prepackage things so that they don't have to do a product selection? We know that folks love to, feel and touch their tomatoes and their cucumbers, but at this point, that may not be something that is either allowed or something that you want in your process and procedure when you're dealing with the public and how they get their product from you. Touchless transactions, we all know about those. We're talking about those credit and debit card machines where you're inserting them and taking them back out. One of the things that you might want to consider is the fact that you can preset with most of your credit card processors the amount where a PIN is required. So, for example, transactions under $25, you slide your card in, it reads the chip, take it back out again, and you're not requiring people to enter their number on the PIN pad. So there's a point of contact that you're eliminating. So that's one strategy that you might employ if you're doing any of those kinds of electronic payment methods. Sampling is probably one of the second most important thing that you want to make sure that you check with your local and state health officials. I know that a lot of states are highly discouraging it. Excuse me, some states are not allowing it. Some local jurisdictions aren't allowing it. So make sure that you check with them to see what the rules are. If, for example, it is allowed and you choose, again, this is your choice, if you choose to do it, you know, the merits of it in terms of marketing, we know we have enhanced sales when we have the ability for customers to sample our products and make choices. But if you have to do, if you want to do sampling, nowadays you're looking at that single serving, prepackaged, and follow those local and state mandates. The other thing that you might want to think about, and let's look at the chat box real quick. What else would you want to consider if someone is at your farmer's market stand and you're giving them a sample of your pickles? You've put it in a souffle cup with a cover and you've handed it to them individually. What next step would you encourage? Anybody have any ideas?
I'm watching.
Put the lid back on and put it in the trash, have them do it.
Providing adequate disposal of it. Exactly, Karen. Good. I think that's Karen. That would be one. There's another important part with this. Wash your hands. D, absolutely. If you're providing a hand wash station, you're going to encourage them to do that, and you may have a sign. Eat it at home. Stephanie, you're getting there.
Yep, eat at home.
Eat at home. Yeah, and so eat at home, taking it back a little bit. Obviously, that customer wants to eat that pickle to decide whether they want to buy a jar of the pickles. But you want to encourage them to walk away, because what are they doing when they unlid that and put their mask back on? Exactly. Yeah. So remember, if they're going to eat, they're going to have a certain period of time when their mask is coming off. So I ask them to walk away, just so that they don't provide that respiratory mode to either your employees or your other customers and guests that may be in line. So let's see. The other thing, there was a controversy early on about using their own bags, and most of you know the big box stores weren't allowing it. So again, checking with those local and state mandates about how they're handling that. What are your other retailers? You know, what are those big box stores doing in terms of being able to provide their own bags? Are you going to do that? Are you going to
and think about too
the t-shirt bags?
Also, when you say deliver to a restaurant, if a grower's delivering to a restaurant, they may have in the past just left their containers there and picked them up later. That picking up a container later from them that's theirs could be a risk because it's been in that restaurant and you have no control over what's happened. If you still choose to do that, you may want to do a lot of what we'll talk about in Module C, cleaning and sanitizing in there. So it's going to be figuring out where all of those pieces fit in. So if customers are bringing bags or containers to the farmer's market, is it allowed? If so, how are you and your staff going to handle with that?
So we're going to bring this back to the point of the individual farm and the choices that you're helping guide your growers through in terms of what strategies and procedures they're going to employ. And remember, some of this may be very counterintuitive to the vision that the farm has. The vision of the farm may be that, you know, you're working towards sustainability and reducing carbon imprints and all that. And some of these strategies that we're talking about may be in
Conflict.
And again, then you add in the piece of perception and folks not knowing how COVID is transferred and what you can and can't get it from. So just being aware that information is important for you to allow your growers to make informed, guided decisions that will be impactful on their operation and what they're trying to do. Next slide. So it's easy.
Cindy, we lost you verbally. So I wonder if her stuff. So let me pick up. So it's easy to forget certain things that we take for granted. So don't forget, training is going to be a critical key in there with any new employees, but also reinforcing what you've already been doing with your current ones. And if you make any changes, documenting what you actually are doing, make it easy for them to remember, document what your training was, when it was done, all of those things on there. Making sure to check what you have on hand, and not just for everything you need for production in there, but all the things for PPE, trying to find masks, trying to find hand sanitizer, trying to find paper towels and toilet paper. We all remember when that was a scarce commodity in there. Making sure to check the local and state agencies and CDC for updates. It is changing. It is changing at least weekly, if not daily. And so making sure that you're staying in up to date with all of that. Oh, and Cindy's reminding me, training is important, not just for employees, but also for guests. So if you have people coming on the farm, it is your job to train them into what your expectations are with it. Also then, as you're going through things, review and adjust your action plan and any SOPs. So if something's not working and you need to modify it, change it, train your employees and customers if necessary in there as well. And I know Cindy's just kind of getting frustrated because her next point is her favorite, which is don't put your action plan on the shelf. So once you figure out how you're going to move forward, how you're going to make all of this happen, the training, the monitoring, the corrective actions, and the documentation, don't just put it on the shelf. And this comes from a collaborator of ours with, this is for you with, but have that action plan being out and being actively used and reviewed as necessary. Cindy, can you speak again? Nope, she can't. So I get to go forward in there. So agritourism, this is normally Cindy's.
Here I am.
There you are. Yay. It's yours again.
Yeah. Sorry about that. My internet has not been doing well the last week. So agritourism, again, you know, you're inviting the public onto the farm. And again, this relates all back to preparing the customers, making sure expectations are clear. If you're able to do some kind of timed reservation, we talked about a lot of our agritourism operations are now doing that online booking. If they're going to bring a school group or they're going to plan on a Saturday afternoon at the farm, they're able to actually go online and register ahead of time. And that's a great place for you to communicate what your expectations are. Also think we'll talk a little later about how landscaping and engineering impact that. Mandate your staff to set the example. it's not acceptable for you to say to your employees or to your general public that you have a mask requirement that includes the nose and mouth, and you're wandering around with one that is not um, covering your mouth, nose rather. Those kinds of things. Making sure that you're able to make accommodations for people that can't wear masks. There are some alternative. Again, we're trying to look at that mechanism of transmission, which is those respiratory particles. So some PPE has to work in concert with other pieces in order to be an effective substitute for mask, i.e. the shields. You have to account for those respiratory droplets that can escape down below, but there are some devices that allow you to put in a chin piece, again, cutting down on that spray that happens with expiration. Uh, Provide that PPE and training and make it situational, meaning as things are fluid and change, making sure that you're able to adapt to that and follow those local and state guidelines. Signs are not the be all end all, and they are not a substitute for training, and they're not a substitute for reinforcing and retraining, but they do help. And again, if your visitors have that expectation when they arrive, then you're reinforcing what you want them to do. Restrooms and hand wash stations, again, you're just going to have to make them really plentiful. Consider your food service, consider those picnic areas. After those kids frolic in the the corn bin that you have set up, do they then go outside to the picnic tables and sit down and have their bag lunch? If so, what can you do? Because we all know that there's lots of scenarios there where you're going to need those extra hand wash stations and supervision, signage, just the whole gamut of things. We talked about payments, any permission forms, having those available online so they can be downloaded and they arrive with them, are really helpful in terms of cutting down on that contact. You have to practice social distancing in and out of the field when you're doing pick your own. So how are you going to do that? In addition to those mask requirements, in the next section, we'll talk about what are the strategies you can do to allow for social distancing in the pick your own field. And there are some basic, easy things that you can do for that. And referring to those state local sampling requirements, reusing picket buckets goes right back to that example for restaurants. If so, who's sanitizing in between? If you're doing disposable, does that meet the criteria that you want on your farm? And if not, are there alternatives? Just thinking all of those things out from looking down and doing a 360 assessment. Next slide. So, what are our summary points? No farm is unique. I'm sorry, every farm is unique. And there's going to have to be a custom approach. Some of those things that we just said don't make sense on your particular farm and operation. If you don't have agritourism, then worrying about cashless transactions and picnic facilities and sanitizing them is pretty irrelevant. So you can kind of take a lot of the guesswork out by walking someone through that whole aerial view of their farm operation. The action plans aren't going to look alike. You're trying to prevent and implement. Barbara and most of the folks in West Virginia, we have always given credit to our growers. They are the most creative people that you will find. If there's a solution to a problem that's going to cost $10,000, they're going to figure out a way to do it under two. So if you understand the mechanics, then your solutions can address those mechanics. And they don't have to be the $600 hand wash station. Now, those are great, and you may want to do those in your agritourism operation because they're easy to upkeep and clean and sanitize. But you don't have to. And I think we've already just talked about several folks in different institutions that are coming up with creative solutions for farmers that are economical. So encourage them to be creative. We already talked about that whole farm approach. And we're gonna address the challenges of the pandemic. We're going to address the challenges of a post-pandemic environment. And we're also going to make sure that we have those strategies in place to employ again. Most folks are under the consensus that COVID is not the first pandemic that we're going to face. So how can we be very flexible and adaptable so that that learning curve is greatly reduced the next time?
Okay, so Cindy and I were juggling with trying to figure out. So here is our flat farm in there, or the farm. And so this was kind of laying out with what a farm might look like that you've got in there. So you've got the farm homestead in there, a play area. You've got not only the high tunnels and field production in there, but you might have a pond in there. You've got a shed where you're storing stuff, even pesticide storage, your packing house in there, as well as goats and chickens. So looking at this whole thing, what we're going to walk through in the last module and talk about some more is the idea of where are points of risk for this farm, to get people to start thinking about what are risks on their farm, because what works here isn't going to work on theirs, but to get them thinking and to get those creative juices going in there. So just pointing out some things to note. The black is the main road, and these are the roads in. You'll notice we've got basically 3 roads into this whole farm. That may be something somebody wants to consider. This farm, in my scenario, has a CSA, and they've always been picking it up at the packing house. That might be something to consider in there. So do you want people roaming around the farm or coming up to the home? They may end up putting, restroom facilities elsewhere for any customers. So we'll be talking about some different practices as we go along. So Cindy, do you want me to?
Yeah. No, I've got it. We're good.
Okay.
So the other thing to look at with that farm is you will find that many of the areas are definitely covered in PSA. And so there's an interconnection there in terms of what you may already have in existence on your farm, be it SOPs or record keeping, and how we're just going to go ahead and enhance all that and look at that SARS-CoV um, interaction and mechanism of transmission and how it relates to your farm. So a lot of this should be pretty intuitive to your growers. They may or may not have it in the form of a farm food safety plan or a gap audit or any of those kind of notebooks and external reviews, but it's really easy to glean that information, use the same resources, and then just up your game. Next slide. So a risk assessment is essential, and I think that focusing on the tools that provide an effective risk assessment, you're facilitating that as the ag service provider. So we encourage you to utilize that skill and help transfer that information and the ability to look at that to your farmers and growers.
And we do have some resources that are additionally helpful. Minnesota's got a really great one that can help, that you can work with a farmer to step through as well. So having those resources available will help.
Yeah, your existing SOPs, training materials, customer notifications, all of those kinds of things may just need to be updated and revised with new health and hygiene practices, issues, and those kinds of things as it relates to SARS-CoV. And again, those things will be in place the next time around. Additional signage, those kinds of things that you might want to consider providing as a tool and a resource to your growers, and all of those resources that we just talked about in terms of helping folks with the assessment, updating procedures, training, Those are all things that really can help you be really effective in developing a plan as it relates to the one-on-one interactions on the farm.
Okay, so we are going to take a 10-minute bio break. For those of you who joined after we did kind of the introduction and the adult education piece, stay on the line for a couple minutes and let me give you some background and give you some heads up. All the rest of you, we'll see you back.